It is now my pleasure to introduce Martina Kalkunis-Ruppel, Dean of the Faculty of Science.
Thanks, Connie. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I always get really excited about the monthly Science Connects webinar and connecting with all of you. This is an opportunity that COVID-19 offers us, and I'm always looking for the positives in a pandemic, and this is certainly one of them. So speaking of COVID-19, we are busy in the Faculty of Science preparing for the fall semester, which is not that far away. We're just a couple of weeks out of welcoming new students and returning students into the Faculty of Science. The majority of our courses are going to be delivered remotely, but we do have a couple of face-to-face classes, as you might imagine, for some of the science-specific training that we do in our labs, especially in the upper years. Our faculty and our staff are working and have been working really hard all summer to diversify and innovate with their teaching methods. And I have no doubt that they're going to be delivering engaging and really high quality learning experiences for our students. And our amazing student services team has been working with incoming students and actually families of incoming students over the summer just to make sure everybody's prepared and understands what this next academic year is going to look like, and making sure that the students have what they need to succeed. We're looking forward from an alumni relations standpoint to bringing the campus to you virtually on September 21st to September 27th for our Alumni Weekend 2020. This is going to be different than previous years, but I think there is lots of opportunity there, and this is going to be called the Campus to Couch edition of Alumni Weekend 2020, and we're going to have a number of really, I think, exciting and engaging events and experiences for our remarkable alumni family. We'll also be sending you in the mail our next issue of Contours magazine, and that's going to be coming out in September. So those are some updates from the Faculty of Science. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Joshua Evans. Joshua is an assistant professor of human geography in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. He's a social geographer and is broadly interested in social exclusion and inclusion as this relates to health and well-being. Joshua's research examines spaces of care, home, and work, and their role in shaping the lived experiences of people that are living in their environments. And he's especially interested in socially marginalized and vulnerable individuals, as well as policy development, implementation, and their role in creating healthy, enabling, and equitable urban environments. He's currently the research lead of the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab based in the Faculty of Science at the University of Alberta. And he's currently working on a goal of affordable housing solutions to empower Edmontonians to innovate, co-create, and develop effective local housing solutions that promote social inclusion and fulfill the right to housing. And I know that we're all interested in this topic, and we're all really excited to listen to Joshua's science and presentation to us. So thank you for being here, Joshua, and take it away.
Thank you, Martina. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I myself am also a U of A alumni, so it's nice to be with all of you fellow alumni here this morning, or maybe perhaps it's the afternoon, wherever you are. Today, I'm going to talk about non-market community housing. And this is an area of research that I've been involved in for the last few years. And when I talk about non-market housing, I'm talking about housing that's provided at a rate below the market value. And this is housing that's typically owned and operated by nonprofit housing societies, by cooperatives, some cases owned and operated by provincial, territorial, and municipal governments. So when I'm talking about community housing, I'm talking about this sector, a sector that in the past and by some has been called social housing. When I was thinking about community housing and how to frame it for today, one of the terms that immediately came to mind is housing affordability. And that's because the very existence of community housing can be linked to the fact that the market has been unable to provide housing that is affordable to everyone, particularly low-income households. So housing affordability is a really important background, really important context to understanding community housing. I just wanted to define housing affordability for you, at least define it how social scientists understand the term. The concept really describes the relationship between people and their housing. And this is a definition that's very typical that you would find in the social science literature. And it's defined as a challenge that each household faces in balancing the costs of its actual or potential housing on the one hand, and its non-housing expenditures on the other, within the constraints of its income. So housing affordability links income and housing and non-housing costs. It also links another important variable, and that's standards. So when we talk about housing affordability, we also have to consider housing standards, both in terms of legal standards, so what we consider adequate and suitable housing, also in terms of cultural standards. And so in terms of people's aspirations, people's preferences in terms of the types of housing, the types of homes that they prefer. So as you can already see, housing affordability is actually quite a complex concept. And so today what I wanted to do was actually just provide a little bit of background context to housing affordability in Canada, talk about how social scientists conceptualize housing affordability, and then talk about the practice of community housing and highlight some of the innovative research initiatives that we've begun here at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Science. So this is a rough presentation outline that I hope to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. I hopefully won't take much longer than that. So I'd like to start with housing affordability, but look at it from the perspective of Canadians and look at it in terms of the Canadian context. And in that context, there's two really important trends to consider. And the first trend is just the rising cost of housing. And in Canada, as in other countries, housing costs have steadily increased over the past decade. And these are just two graphs. Both of them are showing a house price index. The one on the left is the residential property price index going back to 2017. And you can see on this chart, in this graph, an increase in property prices over the last 3 years and quite significantly over the past year. And that's true also for new housing that's added to the housing market. So similarly, you see a rise in house prices among new housing that's added to the market over the past 5 or so years. Now, alongside this trend of rising housing costs is some really important trends when it comes to incomes. And so in this chart, you can see a change in average incomes over time, over the last decade. And those changes are very small. Some people would even describe them as stagnant in the change over time. And so here you can see already a problem between the cost of housing and the incomes that are being earned in Canada, the average incomes that are being earned in Canada. And one of the outcomes of this relationship is growing indebtedness in Canada. So people are borrowing more to purchase housing or to meet their other needs. And we see this in the growth in the debt to disposable income ratio among households in Canada. So this graph here goes all the way back to 1991 up until 2018. And you can see over the last 27, 28 years, a steady growth in debt. And it's really important to point out that this debt is not shared equally by everyone. So the average debt to income ratio is higher for homeowners compared to renters. And it's also much higher amongst younger generations. And we can see that in this chart here with these average debt to income ratios. So indebtedness is one of the outcomes of this relationship between the cost of housing and the incomes that are being earned in Canada. Another outcome is unmet housing need. And so in Alberta, for instance, according to the last census in 2016, about almost 12% of Alberta households, their housing needs were not being met in some way, either in terms of adequacy, suitability, or affordability. And this incidence of what's called core housing need is actually much higher among renters. So about 26% of renters, their experience unmet housing need. And it's among renters themselves, it's significantly high amongst vulnerable populations. So these are populations that face some kind of barrier when it comes to earning income. So here we're talking about seniors, lone parent families, individuals living alone, Aboriginal households, new immigrants to Canada. And so these are groups that experience core housing need. These are groups who have some kind of unmet housing need currently in the housing system. So here I've just tried to sketch very quickly and very generally the background context to housing affordability in Canada, some of the driving trends and some of the outcomes. Next, what I wanted to talk about is how social scientists like myself as a human geographer actually conceptualize housing affordability. So how we define, measure it, how we talk about causation, and how we conceptualize the different responses that can be taken to address housing affordability. So I'm just going to begin here with some definitions and measurements. And some of these definitions and measurements likely you're already familiar with. So first is the expenditure to income ratio. This is probably the most common definition of measurement of housing affordability. And what this refers to is the percentage of income that's paid to obtain adequate and suitable housing. So the driving question here is a household paying more than 30% of gross income on housing? A second valuable and helpful definition and measurement is the residual income approach. Now, this approach looks at the difference between the income that's left over after paying for housing and the income required to purchase a basic basket of non-housing necessities, so a basic basket of goods. So it's really looking at the difference that exists between housing costs and non-housing costs, and ask, can a household afford a basic basket of goods that affords them a basic standard of living? A third very interesting definition measurement that I actually quite like is much more recent, and it's called the rental wage. And this is the hourly wage a person would need to make in order to afford adequate and suitable housing. And so the driving question here is really how adequate are wages in a community given the cost of housing? And so using these, we can develop a kind of composite picture of housing affordability, say, for example, in Edmonton. And so using the income to expenditure ratio, we can see that about 21.6% of Edmonton households, according to the last census, were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So this gives us some sense of the affordability of housing in the city. But again, here with this measure, you have to remember that some income earners at the top of the income ladder probably aren't experiencing much problem here. If they're spending 40%, 45% of their income on housing, but they're making $500,000 a year, their housing affordability stress or burden is likely not as large as someone who's living on the poverty line. And in that case, the residual income measure is much more helpful. It gives us a more precise understanding of the issue. And so if we were to consider those households living on the poverty line using a measure like the low income cutoff, we can see that those households are left in the hole after paying rent and buying basic necessities. Those households living on the poverty line are short around $400 a month. And what this means is that these households are making trade-offs. They're either making trade-offs in terms of buying basic necessities so that they can stay housed. Perhaps they're borrowing, using credit to buy basic necessities. So here we begin to see some of the realities that are shaping some of the contextual trends that I was mentioning earlier. And finally, we have the rental wage. And so the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives came out with a really fascinating report about a year ago on rental wages in Canada. And they calculated that the one bedroom rental wage in Edmonton is $19.89. And that's almost $5 more than the minimum wage. And so what that means is that minimum wage earners need to work around 53 hours a week to afford a one bedroom apartment. And the rental wage I find is very, very interesting. And this is just a chart here that shows median incomes, median after-tax incomes for men and women, and then the rental wages for bachelor, one bedroom, two bedroom, three bedroom apartments. And what you can see here over time, from 2003 to 2017, is very subtle gaps that are growing between the rental wage for these different housing types and the incomes that are being earned. And so this gives us a sense of the affordability challenge, who it's affecting and how. Now, when it comes to causation, social scientists have produced an enormous amount of scholarly literature, mostly among economists. And this literature has pointed to a number of causes. So things like construction costs, government regulation, household growth, income inequality, agglomeration, which is simply the growth in population in urban centers, induced migration, and more recently, financialization. So turning the rental market into a financial store of wealth that's seen as in more speculative terms. Now, in reality, what the takeaway from this scholarship, in my opinion, is that it's actually very difficult to point to one of these as the primary or sole cause of housing affordability problems. In reality, what you find from place to place is a mix, a combination of these different causes, these different causal factors that come together in particular ways, in particular places, to shape housing affordability. So these might come together in particular ways in a resource-dependent province like Alberta that's prone to booms and busts that shape housing affordability in a particular way. And this might look quite different than what you would find in other regions of Canada or in other cities in Canada. So one of the takeaways from the scholarship is that it's quite complex when you get into trying to identify the underlying causes of housing affordability problems. And this is actually quite relevant because you need to have a good understanding of the causes to design solutions. And when it comes to the solutions or responses to housing affordability, there's really three main categories of responses. There's regulatory responses, and this would encompass measures like landlord-tenant acts, rent control, which is a significant regulatory measure that can be taken, inclusionary zoning. A second response is sometimes what's called demand-side responses, and these are measures that are meant to increase the spending power of households to purchase housing in the private market. This often comes in the form of housing subsidies or perhaps tax incentives. And then there are supply side responses. And these are the responses that I'm most interested in. I should say though that when it comes to adequately responding to housing affordability, what we would want to see is a mix of regulatory demand side and supply side. One of these categories on their own cannot address the problem. It's a mix of these responses that's necessary. I'm most interested in the supply side responses, and that's where we find community housing. So non-market housing provided by municipal governments, provincial municipal governments, nonprofit housing societies, cooperatives. And it's this sector that I'm most interested with in my research. And so that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about now, just provide you a very general background to the community housing sector and the practice of community housing. Now, when it comes to community housing and the big picture of community housing internationally, so to speak, this is a very interesting chart, and it shows the stock of social housing as a percentage of the total housing stock in each of these countries' housing systems. And Canada is the bar there in red, and about 4.2% of our total housing stock is social housing. It's today still a very small segment of our broader housing system. And yet the need for social housing is actually quite significant. So in 2018, Statistics Canada estimated that there's approximately 284,000 households in Canada that are on wait lists for social and affordable housing. So there's tremendous need for this sector to grow. At the same time, there's the risk that this sector could shrink. And so this is what makes this, this response, this sector, an important area of research, important area of inquiry. Now, when I look at community housing, I kind of see basic ingredients. And these are the 4 basic ingredients, from my perspective, that you can look at to understand community housing. So there's land ownership, tenure, design, and management. And when it comes to community housing, there's different ways of approaching land ownership, but what community housing shares in common is taking land out of the speculative private market. And in doing so, community housing preserves affordability and perpetuity. Now, when you look at these other ingredients, they do some other things. So combining different forms of tenure, whether it's rental, home ownership, or cooperative, with different kinds of design, private dwellings to shared dwellings with different styles of management, corporate to more collaborative. What is created or fostered are intentional communities. And this is something that in my own work, very interested in, and particularly as it relates to the experience of social inclusion, and more specifically, how it relates to experiences of mental health recovery. And so in my own work, I've really been exploring these intentional communities, how they're supported and created through these basic ingredients, and how we might innovate in this particular area. Now, this slide is a kind of a busy slide, and really what I was trying to do is just convey the diversity that exists in this community housing sector. And so the way these ingredients come together produce a variety of different types and forms of housing. So on one side of the spectrum is that more conventional form of public housing, which is publicly owned by a municipality or perhaps a province, typically managed through some kind of corporate structure, most likely consists of private apartment dwellings that are rented out. On the other side of the spectrum, you might find something like a co-housing community, which is more collaboratively managed, might consist of shared dwellings or a mix of private and shared dwellings. Could consist of a cooperative or some kind of ownership model, and land is held and owned communally. And so along this spectrum, you can find a variety of types and forms of housing, and that's important to acknowledge. Now, one of the main barriers to expanding the supply of community housing is still the tremendous stigma that's attached to social housing. And this social stigma often manifests at the local level in the form of the, not in my backyard conflicts and controversies. And often these controversies are rooted in what I would call myths. And I wanted to address some of these myths very quickly here, because I think they're really important and significant. And I think as academics working in this area, it's important for us to take these myths on and try to demystify them for the general public. Now, the first myth that I often hear is that community housing, social housing, non-market housing is a free handout. And I see this as a kind of disingenuous critique, because if we were to critique community housing on this basis, we should be critiquing home ownership, because home ownership receives enormous subsidies, enormous handouts from different levels of government, whether it's first-time buyer incentives, whether it's home renovation subsidies. CMHC insurance schemes are backed and supported by federal governments and public funds. And so it's not really fair to critique community housing as a free handout, given the significant handouts that have supported the home ownership in Canada. The second myth is that it increases crime in the neighborhood. And really there's little to no evidence in social sciences that supports this, that suggests that affordable housing brings crime to a neighborhood. In fact, what the research shows is that adding suitable and adequate and affordable housing to a neighborhood actually adds to the security of the neighborhood and improves neighborhood quality. And the third myth is that I've heard is that only the poor benefit from this kind of housing. And I'm not sure if that's entirely true, because if you look at some of the community housing projects, that in terms of their design, in terms of integration into neighborhoods, some of these projects add some very valuable amenities to neighborhoods, whether it's in terms of green spaces, community gardens, playgrounds, other kinds of services. And so these are examples where there are some positive spillover effects of community housing. At a more abstract level, I think community housing moves us forward in addressing social inequality in society. And we know that reducing social inequality benefits everybody. It benefits everybody in society, not just those on the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. So I think, I mean, I haven't gone the full distance in identifying all the myths that are addressing these, but I think this kind of activity is actually really important in terms of when it comes to community housing in Canada. Now, I wanted to end here by just talking a little bit about how we're researching community housing at the University of Alberta. And I'm going to talk about just a few projects. One in particular I spend most of my time talking about, but in both cases, these initiatives are involving faculty members from across the university, from other universities across Canada. And I think what makes them unique is that they're occurring or they're placed right at that interface between the community and the university. And also the interface between the sciences and the social sciences and public policy. And so I think that's what makes these research initiatives quite unique. And the two that I really wanted to highlight here are the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab and Community Housing Canada. Community Housing Canada, I'll just talk briefly about that one. My colleague, Dr. Damien Collins, is the lead investigator. This is a very significant project that is supported by a grant from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council and the CMHC. And we just acquired this funding this past spring. And these funds are supporting collaborations with community housing partners across Canada and the United Kingdom and in New Zealand. And it's a very exciting 5-year research program and the goal of this program is really to explore the social sustainability of community housing going forward. The second initiative here that I'm going to spend most of my time talking about as I'm the research lead is the Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. And this is a more locally focused initiative. And here we're really aiming to experiment with new and innovative approaches to affordable housing here in Edmonton. And this is an initiative that's funded by the City of Edmonton, who's one of the partners in this. It's based here in the Faculty of Science. And we've also begun to bring on additional partners into this lab, which is actually really important and really exciting. So that includes the Social Innovation Institute at MacEwan University, and it also includes the Edmonton Community Development Corporation. Now, this lab really exists to empower citizens to innovate and co-create and develop local affordable housing solutions. So really what we're aiming to do in this lab is create a space where people can come together, stakeholders in the community housing sector and people who have an interest in affordable housing more generally can come together and identify potential solutions with regard to expanding the stock, expanding the supply of affordable housing in Edmonton. Now, one of our, I guess, sort of flagship initiatives, our first initiative here is what we're calling the Pivot. And the Pivot is going to be about a 1 to 2 year research program. It's going to consist of a number of community-based participatory research projects, each focused on one of these topics that I've listed here. And I'll just kind of try to explain this crude diagram here that I created. I'm not an artist, but I tried my best to convey the metaphor here. But we chose the name Pivot because we wanted to convey that community housing is pivotal to the health and well-being of the community. So it's central to the success of Edmonton. But we also wanted to draw on the term pivot in that second sense, in that what we'd like to do is pivot the community towards in a direction that can supply additional affordable housing. And we envision doing that by exploring innovations, exploring solutions in terms of land, in terms of tenure, in terms of design, in terms of sustainability. And in developing learning in each of these areas in collaboration and partnership with community organizations, we hope to be able to shift the community and address some of the unmet housing needs that exist here in Edmonton. So just some quick concluding comments here. I hope I haven't taken too much time, but just reflecting back on the presentation here, I think one of the takeaways that I hope you leave with today is that it's just with a general understanding of housing affordability, but an understanding of housing affordability as a complex problem with multiple causes. I think this is really important because it's very difficult to find that silver bullet solution for housing affordability. And it's a problem that demands a multi-pronged, multifaceted response. Now, among those responses, I believe, and the research that I'm undertaking is focused on community housing, which I see as one long-standing and one socially valuable response to housing affordability problems. And I see it as a socially valuable response because I see community housing going beyond just the economic piece of affordability to contributing in socially valuable ways to communities locally and provincially and nationally. But in saying that, community housing is diverse, dynamic, but like I mentioned earlier, it's still, inadequate in terms of its size and supply to meet the need. And it's at risk of shrinking. And so its sustainability is going to require some innovation and transformation. And this is where academics and community can come together to, through this kind of community-based research, as I've outlined earlier, with one example being the Housing Affordability, Affordable Housing Solutions Lab. This is the role that researchers can play in addressing this challenge. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope you found that helpful and useful. I'm happy to try and answer any and all your questions, and or at the very least refer you to some of the answers if I don't have those.
Absolutely. Thank you for your presentation, Joshua. It's so interesting. We do have some questions, and I'll read through them. So one question actually is a follow-up from what you were just talking about the role that researchers play here. And the question is about researching solutions to affordable housing. What are the methods that you use to engage, consult, and communicate with the most vulnerable populations who potentially benefit from the outcomes of this work? And this is especially in consideration of the fact that, you can't use online surveys or things like that. I mean, they just don't have some of the things that we would typically think about as just being the way to communicate. So what do you do in terms of interacting with those populations?
Great question. And, this is something that we've thought long and hard about and have had to actually try to innovate in the context of COVID-19 and the disruption that it's brought. And I don't know if you noticed in the slide one of my previous slides, as I was describing the pivot, there is a term equity-centered design. Mm-hmm. And that's one of that term equity-centered design is really important to the work the lab's doing, and it's quite central to how we plan to work with the community. And so what we're signaling with that term is that there are some really significant power relations and power dynamics that exist around housing and in the community. And so we have to actually think proactively and intentionally about how we can involve those most marginalized and those who may not have the resources in terms of time, for example, or even technology to participate in some of the activities that we have planned. And so being very cognizant of that equity piece is quite crucial to the work we're doing. And so there's a number of ways that we're planning to address this. And so with the pivot, one of our first activities is actually collaborating with community members to come up with the research questions that we want to try and answer. And to do that, we initially imagined bringing people together in a room for meetings, face-to-face meetings, and that's just not possible now. So we're having to rethink that and work in using platforms more like this. But to do that, I think we're going to have to equip some members of the community with the resources and means to do that. And we're lucky to have the support of the city and some resources and capacity at the university to be able to do that. And that's really important. And so, one of the other things that we've undertaken as well is what we're calling a fellows program. And so we're involving right now, we've recruited 8 fellows. And these are fellows who are from the community, from various diverse backgrounds. And this includes experts who've been working in the community housing sector for years, as well as people with lived experience who've lived in affordable and social housing. And so we're planning to work with them through some learning activities, aiming to help them increase their learning around affordable housing, but also aiming to work with them to, enhance our own learning when it comes to these different projects. So that's another example of how we plan to work. But to be honest, it's a little uncertain going forward. I mean, it's something that I think we're going to have to be very adaptive and flexible to in navigating the next few months in terms of the current state that we're in.
Okay.
So I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, this is a really tough, things are difficult in the best of times with a project like this, but I imagine that you're really having to rethink some of the original plans in terms of communicating with all of the stakeholders. So next question is, Margaret Thatcher privatized council flats, allowing ownership by tenants. Can you talk about that policy and the results of the policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. The United Kingdom is, certainly, comparatively to Canada, had a much larger stock of public housing, especially after World War II, when many cities in England had to completely rebuild, and part of that rebuilding were these massive housing projects and really significant investments in housing. But in the 70s and 1980s, different schemes were developed to renew that housing, and that included selling some of that housing to tenants. And so I think what that policy scheme and those policy decisions really reflect is the priority or primacy that's given to home ownership. And I think that's something that we have to think critically about and think carefully about. So certainly the driving, rationale behind those Thatcher policies was that home ownership offered a better model of tenure than rental. But home ownership certainly has its benefits, but perhaps it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think what we find in home ownership, as homes are more and more seen as a store of wealth rather than a place to live, that contributes to rising housing costs, not only for homeowners, but also it spills over into the rental market. Mm-hmm. So there's actually some very interesting, historical work among social scientists that have looked exactly at the implications, the repercussions of those Thatcher decisions, over the past few decades. And for any of you who are interested in those resources, those books, I'm happy to recommend any to you. So I welcome any emails if you'd like recommendations of those specific sources. I haven't personally myself studied that UK context in detail, but there's some very great books that have been written on it.
Okay, and we'll follow up on that after. So a couple of other questions are coming in, and I want to make sure we get to them. This is really interesting, and your talk was really interesting. These questions are really interesting, but so there is a question: can you speak to the potential for older homeowners whose homes are too large for them to share their homes with young people just starting out? Is that something that's right within the realm of the possible?
I think that's an amazing idea. It's something that's starting to be talked about. And this is what I would characterize as an innovation, because what we're talking about here is repurposing space and land. And, but also, we're also talking about sharing dwellings in a way that, hasn't been done for decades. I mean, way back, decades and decades ago, it was very common to sublet and rent rooms in homes.
Mhm.
And that's something that we've sort of moved away from over the decades. Um, but given the age demographics of Canadian society, and there's more and more unused residential space, and there's also older adults who are seeking out ways to address isolation, who might need help in terms of maintaining the home. And so this is the kind of intent, I would maybe put this under the umbrella of intentional communities as well, right? In terms of addressing not only the need for additional affordable housing, but also, seeking out some of the additional social benefits that can be derived from these kind of innovative housing practices. So I think that's an incredible idea. It's something that in the lab, we hope to try to prototype. And by prototype, I mean, okay, so this is the idea, but do we need a policy around this? What would that policy look like? Would people renting out these rooms require some kind of security, or what would they require to feel comfortable in engaging in this kind of arrangement? What do people renting the suites need? So I think this is where within the space of the lab, we would take that idea and try to operationalize it and make it work.
Right. And as you were talking, I mean, the other thing too, which just occurred to me is, Airbnbs and things that are totally changing the landscape that way. And it just speaks to the amount of housing that's actually available.
Yes.
But anyway, okay, some other questions. So can you give us a sense of how many people, what is the population, either in sort of total number or percentage, of people that don't have homes in Alberta, and like they don't have a place to go to sleep in?
Good question. Very good question. I mean, in Edmonton, Homeward Trust, which is a really important agency in the city that collects statistics and documents the prevalence of homelessness. They have a by names list, and that's a real-time list of all the people who've been identified as homeless, as being identified as unhoused here in Edmonton. And currently there's around 1,700 people on that list.
Okay.
It might be a little higher now because of the circumstances over the past few months in Alberta, and then in the context of COVID are quite significant. So, I'd estimate anywhere between 1,700 and 2,000 individuals in Edmonton are currently without housing.
Okay.
Now, and then, if there's also people who are precariously housed in Edmonton, right? So these are people who maybe are in housing that's a little too much, that, it's costing them a lot and they're having to make trade-offs, or they're in a 1-bedroom and they have a large family, they need a 3-bedroom. And then they may have low incomes and have applied for social housing and are on a wait list. And, when you look at the wait list for the biggest provider here in Edmonton of social housing, that's Capital Region Housing, there's about 6,000 households on that wait list. So when you look at those numbers just for the city of Edmonton, it's quite significant. I think at the last census, I think about 14% of households in Edmonton met the criteria for core housing needs. So they were either, their housing was either insufficient in terms of affordability, suitability, and adequacy. So that gives you a picture of Edmonton. Of Alberta, I don't know if from the top of my head, if I could draw those exact numbers for Alberta.
Could you say whether Alberta is higher or lower than, say, other provinces in Canada? Or do we just not know those numbers?
In terms of homelessness?
Yes.
Yes, explicitly. Alberta has ranked relatively high amongst the provinces. I mean, if you looked at it per capita, and part of that is because of looking further back in time, our resource-dependent economy has been characterized by some very significant booms.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And that context has resulted in a lot of hardship for some households and some individuals. But the homelessness rates are significantly high in other cities in Canada as well, like Toronto, Vancouver, And in these large cities where you have, large populations, and you also have a concentration of services that people require to survive and gravitate towards, you'll find a higher numbers of homeless people.
Okay, I'm going to get a couple more questions in here, Joshua. One is about recreational vehicles like RVs and things, and there's lots of RVs on our landscape. So what is, are there barriers, or is that something that's within the sort of realm or art of possibility for solutions?
I mean, I think so. Because, and what we're really talking about here, if you recall that first slide where I was talking about the definition of housing affordability, I noted it definitely links to income, definitely links to cost, but it also involves standards. And I think what we're talking about in this case is expanding our standards when it comes to housing, because generally speaking, a recreational vehicle, culturally speaking, and even, legally speaking, is not a permanent resident. But, could we expand our imagination in ways and make spaces available where perhaps those might be seen as such? I think we could. And I mean, one of the constraints in a city like Edmonton, a province like Alberta, is that we are a northern city. And so we do have extreme temperatures in the winter. But, I think when you look at things like camping in our river valley, encampments more generally, I mean, these are controversial because they don't meet that cultural standard of housing. Yet in many ways, they're providing a lot of the things that we who are housed gain from our housing in terms of shelter, safety, support. So, I think it's a great question, and it's really poking at, the normative cultural understandings that we bring to housing, and in how in some ways innovation involves pushing the boundaries of those.
Right. So I'm going to ask one more question and just say that we'll make sure that these questions get answered. And gosh, we could talk for hours, couldn't we, about all of this? So there's a question here about co-housing for older adults, given the demographics that you spoke of. So where do you see that headed? So do you see a change happening there, especially given some of the demographic issues?
Yeah, I mean, I get really excited about co-housing communities and the potential, because even in the amongst co-housing communities, and co-housing communities are very diverse. I mean, these, in terms of the form and types that you might find, these can be apartment buildings with just some small shared spaces, but really people are living in private dwellings. But they, on the other end of the spectrum, are actually large multifamily homes with shared kitchens and shared living spaces and maybe some aspects of private dwelling. So, I mean, there's quite a variety in the form that co-housing takes. But really what is at the essence of co-housing is this interest in sharing physical space and in kind of a commitment to mutuality, to helping others and supporting others as part of a community. And I think there's, tremendous potential in this area. And I think, as time moves on here, I think as the questions really, gesturing at, I think there's going to be more demand for that kind of housing and that kind of supportive community. One of the challenges when it comes to co-housing is actually to create a co-housing community requires a tremendous amount of pre-planning, coordination. You need significant amounts of capital if you're building, a project from scratch. And from the time that planning starts to when you move into that building or home or whatever, it could be 2 to 3 years. So it does take serious commitment amongst a small group at the initial stages. And I think one of the things perhaps that, we could look at is how to support those kinds of communities, nascent communities, from ideation to actually moving into there. So what kinds of supports and resources might help people who are interested in building those resident-led kinds of developments.
Yeah. Well, so there's a few other questions that are more about the data and how do we know and where is the information? Some questions about definitions and policy. So we'll share those with you.
Yeah.
I think they'll be the answer to those will be sort of directed, let's say, to specific resources. So I think with that, truly, I want to thank you for this because I know that it's been interesting for all of us. And it's not surprising to me, but every Science Connects webinar, we could literally spend the whole day diving into each of the things that you brought up. So thank you so much for taking time, Joshua, to talk to us about your work. It's fascinating and it's so relevant for all of us. These are things that we all need to be thinking about. And I can tell by the questions that people really are thinking about this. And sometimes you go about your daily business and you just forget about what it takes for a city to be a city and for housing to exist and everything in between. Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing your scholarship with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm sure that you agree that this has been really interesting and just always surprises me, the diversity and just innovation that comes out of the Faculty of Science in terms of different areas of scholarship. So with that, we're finishing today's Connect seminar, but I want to invite everyone to join us on September 21st to 27th for Alumni Week Campus to Couch. This is a special edition, special pandemic edition of Alumni Week, and we're just really moving our regular Alumni Weekend celebrations online, and we'd love for you to be there with us. Watch for the post-webinar email that will include more ways for you to connect with your Faculty of Science community, opportunities for you to support research and programs that you're learning about in the Faculty of Science. We'll loop back on some of the answers to questions from today's program that Joshua will answer. And please share your feedback with us. It was great spending time with you today. Please take care of yourselves and stay in touch with us. Goodbye, everyone.